Thank you for coming back to Ralph World. As always, I am your host, Uncle Britt, and with me is...
Mac.
And tonight we are talking East versus West. When it comes to the comic versus manga, we have cartoon and anime, and representing the West, we have Mac. He will be your comic book cartoon guy. On the East, you have me, manga and anime. I am far more invested into anime and manga than I am cartoons growing up, and that's really the linchpin for why I wanted to talk about this one today. I pretty much grew up on manga and anime and being exposed to this stuff while also being exposed to cartoons. Not so much comic books, I never personally got into them, but from where I was from, manga and anime were fairly popular. It wasn't mainstream like it is now, but it definitely was growing around me. Whereas comic books, for me, had kind of the opposite. As I got older, they got smaller, and the superhero genre in the movies is a little different because that obviously exploded. But if we're just talking comic to manga, manga was much more prevalent in my childhood than I think it was with his. And we've talked about this, but you said you had a lot of cartoons and comic books in the beginning, and then anime is something that sort of, for lack of a better term, got shoehorned into programs and everything as you got older.
Well, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, like we had cartoons that were anime. We just didn't realize that it was anime at the time. A few of the ones that pop right off the top of my head are Speed Racer, Battle of the Planets, and Star Blazers, which is also known as a space battleship Yamato. And those were very popular in the 70s, like when I was a wee tyke. But then when we got into the 80s, we also had things like Voltron and Transor Z, which is known in the East as Mazinger Z. We just didn't know what it was at the time. The idea of We just thought they were really cool looking cartoons. The idea of full-blown anime, Japanese animation, didn't really come into our consciousness, into our awareness until, like, I want to say the mid 80s when Robotech came on the scene. And we watched that, me and my brother and like all of our friends watched that, and it was unlike anything we had really seen before. People were dying on a regular basis. It was very much like a war series. And then you had main characters dying as well. It just was like unlike anything storytelling wise that we had seen before. The art style we had seen before because of the series that I talked about previously. But it wasn't until that it really became, as far as I can remember in the 80s, being the wee tyke that I was, it wasn't until Robotech that things really became focused around anime, which at the time was called Japanimation. And when Robotech came on the scene, and then we found out that it wasn't really one series, it was 3 separate series that this American producer imported and then smashed together into one long series. That when we found out it was 3 separate series, then we wanted to find out more about those and about what made that work and made that tick. And then that's when we really started to become aware of it at the conventions. At like, they were all basically Comic Cons at the time. It was before you had things like Steel City Con or San Diego Comic Con or Joe Fest or Power Con or all these different cons. They were just all like Pittsburgh Comic Con, the Philadelphia Comic Con, the Ohio Comic Con, things like that. And believe it or not, they were just comic books. But Robotech was the one that really started to draw our attention to, this isn't just a art style. This isn't just a different art style. This is a complete different way of storytelling for animation, where it's not really for kids. Like, I mean, kids can watch it, but like, it's really a much more mature storytelling style where people can die. It wasn't until the 90s that we really became aware of manga. I mean, there were people that were like, that knew about it, but like, it really wasn't until the 90s that like the idea of manga became so popular that it would eventually grow into what it is today.
I think for me, what's interesting is I was actually watching a video earlier today, and they said it almost perfectly. You didn't grow up with manga. It came in later.
Yes.
I grew up with manga.
Right.
I grew up with manga more than I grew up with comic books. As a matter of fact, I don't think I read a comic book before I read a manga. I think manga happened first for me. I've just been exposed to this stuff far more than I have been comic books, with the exception of the movies. Like, the movies, very wildly popular. I've watched all the MCU movies, you know, all that.
Yeah.
But I never got into the comic books. I never got really into the shows, into the cartoons, or any of that. And I think part of it, and not that it's the detriment to the whole comic society or anything, but my issue was it was very tame most of the time.
Comics.
Like, or at least the ones that I would see, there weren't like crazy violence, there wasn't blood, there wasn't like maturity to it. And not to say that it didn't have good stories or anything like that, but whereas I pick up like Demon Slayer, and the first volume of Demon Slayer, his entire family is destroyed and killed, and he walks into it, and then he's starting to talk about how the smell of blood is an omen for impending death in his life now. Like, that's wildly dark to me.
Right.
But where you flip over and it's like Superman, I mean, he had a pretty dark origin too. His entire planet gets destroyed, but past that, it's just a dude landing on Earth and growing up in good old Southern values. Like, it just didn't have that weight to me the same way anime or manga does. But since meeting you and meeting other people that have read comics, I have expanded what I've seen and what I've read, and I have since seen darker sides of comic books and whatnot. But I think personally, I think Japan does it better, if I'm being honest. I think the format that manga has is a better way to tell these kinds of stories. Because like you said, actually right before we started recording this one, that comic books are very small.
Yes.
Like, they're very short. It's a couple chapters or whatever. And whereas you have this, like a manga, volume 1, this is probably
like 160 pages.
Yeah, something of... Okay. Doesn't have a number. Fantastic. But yeah, it's going to be over 100 pages of content in this one book.
Yeah.
And just on paper as a kid, and truthfully as an adult, I think it's more worthwhile to get a manga than it is to get a comic book. Outside of collecting, I would just always wait for a graphic novel to be produced for a comic. Like, we've been reading Something is Killing the Children.
Oh, you're talking about the trade paperbacks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
when they sell them in like lots of 5.
Yeah, like, I don't need the small one that's going to give me a single chapter or 2 chapters. I'd rather just wait for volume 1 of whatever the story is to come out, read the whole book like a graphic novel. But I think when it comes to comic books, with me growing up and being online the way it's been, I think that was a major detriment to comic books in the early and late 2000s with me, because anime...
What do you mean being online?
Like the internet and everything.
No, but I mean, like, what was online? Oh, you mean you just being online?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, just the internet becoming mainstream and everything. Like, I could go online and finally start finding this stuff.
Okay.
Whereas comic books, it was almost like, well, I can go down to the comic store and buy the past 50 years of Superman comics, but I don't have that much money. Or I can get online and look up a bootleg version of One Piece and start reading it on there for free. I just think it was more accessible, really, with me.
Well, I do think it's more accessible, and that's actually one of the things we're going to be talking about is, like, manga is outselling traditional comic books right now. And if you talk to a lot of manga fans, they trumpet that it's because there's better storytelling, that the characters are more interesting, that it's written better. I don't I personally don't feel one is better than the other. They're very different, but I don't think one is better than the other. But I do think one of the reasons that manga is outselling comics, traditional comic books, is the accessibility issue. That in the 80s, in the 90s, you could walk into a bookstore, you could walk into a newsstand, you could walk into a grocery store, you could walk into pretty much anywhere and buy comic books on those. Remember, I don't know if you've ever seen those old metal squeaky racks that turn. Every grocery store, every newsstand, 7-Eleven, places like Sheetz, if they would have been around at the time, they would have had them, that you could go pretty much anywhere and buy a comic. And they were like very reasonably priced because they knew kids are going to be walking in with like their allowance. I was able to walk into like the local pharmacy, which was Harlick's, walk up to the comic stand with a $5 bill in my hand and walk out of there with like 5 issues and some candy. Okay. It was about the late 90s, early 2000s that the comic shops started, they were losing money because people could just go anywhere and buy comics. And for some reason, they all got together, and I don't know if it was the comic shops that pushed this or if like the distributors like Diamond wanted to do this, but for some reason they stopped selling comic books everywhere, and now you have to go to a comic shop or subscribe online and have it mailed to you, and not even all of the titles you can do that with. That like physically getting your hands on them has become harder. Like it's not as convenient as it used to be. Whereas manga, like they may not be selling it in grocery stores, but you can walk into Barnes and Noble, you can walk into like certain hobby shops.
Oh, you can get them at Walmart and Target.
You can. I wasn't
Now, that's going to be like your popular, like, One Piece, Dragon Ball, Naruto. You're not going to get much out of the mainstream with it. But yeah, you can walk in there, buy, like, collections and whatnot.
Okay. I knew you could get the DVDs for, like, the anime. I never really noticed that you could get manga there. So, like, physically getting your hands on it is much more accessible for manga. And then that leads into the other issue, that for those of you who are listening and aren't watching the video on YouTube, a single volume that we were just talking about that's $10 gets you like 100 to like 140 or 160 pages. For $8, comparatively speaking, you get 2 comics. Okay? There is a huge, huge difference in what you get for your money between comic books and manga. And when they started raising the prices, when they started to probably basically compensating for lack of distribution, they weren't reaching as many people, they weren't selling as many comics, they weren't selling to the casual person that would just be like, hey, that's Superman. I know who Superman is. Let's pick that up. They started raising the prices, and the prices like went up very quickly in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like it went from being able to spend like $1.25 per issue to going up to like $5 or $6 per issue. The price has since come down because I think they realized they went way too high and people just stopped collecting for a while. But it's still like $4 or $5 for a comic. It still feels like way too much for what you're getting. The other thing personally that I can appreciate manga over comics, when you look at a comic, when you're flipping through a comic, whether it's Marvel, whether it's DC, maybe not so much some of the indie titles, but you can very clearly see that this was done in like a digital realm. Like this wasn't hand drawn. Like it might have been hand drawn, but it was hand drawn on a tablet and the image was digitally rendered. Manga, I don't know if that's their style, but it's still, when you open it up and you read it, it still very much has that hand drawn feel to it. And I very much appreciate that because that does add to you're getting something for your money.
I will say with the drawing, for those of you who don't know, my favorite is One Piece, so I'm going to be referencing that a lot. But with One Piece, the creator, Oda, he draws the entire series. It's been going on since, I think, 1997, the manga.
Okay.
He's drawn all of it.
Mm-hmm.
He's gotten help and everything as he's gotten older. But what I found out is the mentality in Japan when it comes to this is wildly different than it comes to comic books. The guy who creates whatever his story is for One Piece, it's Oda, his entire life is centered around this book.
Okay.
Like, I think 7 days out of the week, and for 10 hours of each of those days is spent solely drawing One Piece.
Okay.
Like, he had just recently gotten eye surgery, actually. And so he's...
Oh, yeah, I heard about this. So, like, the series has been put on hold.
The series is completely not done, but it's on a break for like 2 months right now. And it's solely because without him, they cannot make One Piece because he's the one drawing and creating it. And obviously, this is a story that's been going on for 20 some odd years now. He has a little bit more pull than smaller ones. But the mentality in Japan when it comes to one of these, if it gets popular and like it gets picked up by Shonen Jump, and I can get into all of that if you aren't aware of how it works, but once it gets picked up by Shonen Jump and if it gets popular off of that and it gets its own series outside of the magazine, their entire life has to be then dedicated to that story because it becomes a weekly serial for them.
Okay.
They have to have a next chapter in Shonen Jump if it's popular.
Okay.
So, like, over there, it's really is a way of life. If you get a popular story, your family is second, and it has to be. Like, Oda's favorite thing to say when he hires new people for the show is, get ready to lose your life because you have to be fully dedicated to this. And he has fully followed through with that promise. He is forced, or I shouldn't say forced, but he has had people stay in the studio and work on One Piece to get it out in time.
Okay. And I think that is another big difference between manga. Well, I don't think I know that's another big difference between manga and comics. He owns One Piece. Like, he is the creative mind behind One Piece. When he dies, it's done. When Akira dies, Dragon Ball is done.
Well, yeah.
Which should have been done a long time ago. That's another... We'll get into that, I'm sure. Marvel, DC, these characters are owned by a company. And they are making decisions based off of profit, off of what will make money or what they think will make money. And it, a lot of times, like, the choices they make come off very hollow. They come off very out of character. They come off because, hey, this is the popular thing right now. Let's change this character to go into that. And it's like, then you kind of like lose interest in the character and you lose readers. Whereas like before, when Marvel was Marvel, like not necessarily still owned by Stan Lee, but Marvel was its own entity and DC was its own entity before it was bought by Warner Brothers. I feel like you had better quality writing coming out, like in the 80s, in the 90s. Like that's like the big company mentality coming into the comics, I believe, is one of the main reasons that like Todd McFarlane and a bunch of the young artists and creators broke away and created Image Comics, so they would own their character. Like McFarlane and Spawn right now is probably the closest thing, the closest creator story relationship there is to manga. That like Todd owns Spawn, Todd writes Spawn. When Todd is gone, depending on how, and truthfully, I'm not sure there is an Image Comics without Todd McFarlane. But like when Todd is no longer of this earth, I won't be surprised if like Spawn just ends.
I think it is interesting to look at the different like cultural viewership of this kind of stuff, because we can sit here and bat the differences back and forth, but at the end of the day, we're really talking about the same thing, just expressed through two different cultures. Like, this is a comic book is manga. They are almost the exact same thing, just slightly formatted different.
It's the format, it's what you're getting for the money. And like truthfully, I've I've been very much into anime since I've became aware of what it was, which would have been Robotech. And after Robotech, I got into things like Akira. I got into things like Vampire Hunter D. The old series that I can't remember, Ninja Scroll, things like that. But I've never been able to pick up a manga and read it, and it's not the format. It's not because it's read the reverse of what we read here in the States. It's just that for me, what happens on screen can be so emotionally grabbing, can be happening so fast that I feel like when I'm reading something that I know there's a movie for anyway, I feel like that by reading it, I'm slowing myself down. Like Dragon Ball is a prime example. Although there are certain points of Dragon Ball, the animated series, where they were padding it out.
Yeah.
And it was like, now begins the 3-episode stare down of before the 5-episode final battle of the 6-episode climax. Like when they padded Dragon Ball Z out, that really slowed it down. But when it got to the fights, like there was nothing that like I felt like reading a manga could do for me when I'm watching Vegeta blow himself up to take out Majin Buu, or I'm watching Goku freak out and go Super Saiyan for the first time. Like, if I know there's a series or a movie, I would much rather watch that than read it, which is ironically kind of like the complete opposite I feel for comic books.
Which is the flip for me.
Yeah.
I won't even say that, though, because I'm not a big reader. I'm really not. I prefer visual media. Like, I just prefer TV, movies, even music. Like, I know music isn't visual, but
I get you, yeah.
I'm much more of a visual person. I have trouble just sitting down and reading something.
Okay.
But when it comes to, like, again, One Piece versus the anime, the manga versus the anime, I mean, the anime is different because they've had to do filler arcs. Not a lot, not necessarily anything bad, but they've done filler arcs. They have to pad episodes to keep it behind the manga and everything. So when it comes to stuff like that, I understand not really caring about the difference of reading it or watching it. I'll just watch it. It's a better experience altogether. But I think certain stories lend itself better to certain mediums.
Okay.
I think One Piece is better to read. And it's mainly because of Oda's sense of style and everything. He does a really good job of drawing your eye where it needs to go on the page.
Okay.
And you completely lose that when it comes to an anime because you're just going to shift to the scene that you want them to see next.
Okay.
And like there are splash panels in manga, much like comic books, where it's, you know, the entire thing is one scene or whatever. And Oda does that a lot. He does not keep to the box mentality on the page. Like, he will make an entire page one scene, and then he'll put like 9 boxes on the next page.
Okay.
Like, he constantly is changing it up to fit what he's doing at that part. And I think that just is more interesting of experiencing the story of One Piece than it is in the anime.
Okay.
But having said all that, as of right now, towards the end of June, One Piece is breaking records in the anime. And I'm not sitting here trying to blow on it, but like as of right now, it has broke records with what they're doing in the animation. So that's to say, like, the animation for One Piece is really, really good. It has a lot of money put into it, a lot of care put into it.
Okay.
But it's also been around for 20 some odd years. You go back to the beginning, and I'll be the first to tell you, One Piece didn't start with great animation. you kind of got to just buy into it and like it, or you don't buy into it and you don't like it.
Okay.
There's really not a middle ground. The proportions are weird. A lot of times they don't even fully draw the backgrounds. It's just 90s early anime aesthetic.
Okay.
But as it's gone on, it's gotten a lot better. But if you read it, whether I read volume 1 or I read volume 101, Oda's style is the exact same. I'm going to be pulled across the page the same way I was pulled from the first one. So if nothing else, there's more consistency when it comes to the manga than it does from the anime. Again, whether that's good or bad, the anime might improve or the manga might stay crap and end crap.
Okay.
But I just think the manga is for all intents and purposes, it is the source material, I mean, obviously, that will remain constant to the author's actual idea of what the story is. Because another example to that would be Full Metal Alchemist.
Oh.
The story in the manga takes a lot more, no, I'm saying this backwards. The Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood takes a lot of its plot points very closer, or much closer to the manga.
Yes.
Whereas the original Full Metal Alchemist anime, to my knowledge, after like the first 50 episodes, just made its own story after that and did its own thing.
And I didn't realize that until I watched, because I watched Full Metal Alchemist and I was like really into it. It was really tragic. There were some really dark moments to it.
Like the dog?
That whole chimera thing with the daughter and everything. But then after I was done watching it, that's when I found out about Brotherhood. And it was like, this is really what the story is about. And I gotta be honest, like after I was done watching Full Metal, I was like, I don't know if I can do this again, man. I feel like I need therapy after watching it. I don't want to see him chimera his kid and his dog again.
I don't need that on my conscience.
Yeah. And having never been into the manga, having been more into the anime, there was even a point where like a lot of modern anime, like it just wasn't grabbing me anymore. Because when we talked about this before we started recording, like one of the things that made like viewers, Americans as a society, step back and go, whoa, was Akira. Like it's iconic for a reason in anime and in manga. Like there's a reason that movie is iconic across both cultures, I feel. But and then I watched things like Vampire Hunter D, and then Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, which was the sequel, and then you got things like Ninja Scroll, and then there was another ninja one that I can't remember that was less popular, but it was still just as like gory and bloody. That like by the time we got to what is actually one of my favorites, Dragon Ball Z, I felt like it was toning things down.
It was.
Yeah. It was really toning things down on the gore, on the violence. And while I liked Dragon Ball, like I couldn't help but notice that there was that change. And it just felt like things were becoming more and more like saccharine, more and more saturated in their storytelling, in the intensity they went, just all that. Which is why when you try to get me into My Hero Academia, like when I watched the first season, I was like, okay, this is cool, this could go places. But like after I know it's not seasons, it's arcs. But like when we got to them in the school, and then we were getting to the part where they should have been graduating from school, and they were doing like all their internships with like the heroes.
Oh, the end of year one.
Yeah. When they were doing like all their internships with like their heroes and everything, I was actually kind of bored with it.
No, I understand. I get it. And really the only thing I can say when it comes to that is you have to get past that. Because for all intents and purposes, that is the calm before the storm.
Okay.
Like that, the intention of that part is for you to understand the world, like the greater world outside of these kids in this school, so that you understand what's coming next, why it's coming, and how it's coming, and you see the cracks forming. But I completely understand what you mean. There is a lull to My Hero.
Yeah.
Like you have this big beginning, you see All Might fighting and all this other stuff, and then it's just like you're just kind of gone back to kid activities and back to school.
Yeah.
And I do get it. Trust me, I get it. But if you can get past, honestly, probably the next little arc that you're in right now, it then takes off. And whether that's a detriment to the story or not, that's for you to decide. But there is a lull. I won't lie to you.
Well, and that's why it honestly took me, like, even when you mentioned it to me, like, you never, like, really pushed it on me, but, like, when you mentioned Demon Slayer, like, that's why it took me so long to get into Demon Slayer, because I was like, if this is, like, the way anime goes now, these TV series, that they're just kind of stretched out, dragged out for time, padded out, I'm really not going to be that into it. But then for one night, for whatever reason, I sat down and I was like, okay, I'm just going to give this a shot. I think it was like there was like nothing else left to watch, and I wanted to try something new. So I put on the first episode of Demon Slayer, and like it had me hooked from the beginning. The horror of the family being butchered, the sister being this demon, which is basically a vampire, just
in Japanese culture, for those of you who don't know, demons are what Americans would think of as vampires, and then their demons are more...
They're like Oni. Yeah. But, and then like they faced this demon hunter, and there was the fight there, and it just like hit the ground running. And it very much was giving me vibes of Ninja Scroll, of Vampire Hunter, just like the action, the emotional anchor that was holding everything together, like just everything that my hero was missing for me from the type of like storytelling anime that I grew up on, which is why like I really don't think I'm into a lot of the newer anime, because it I don't know, like it doesn't really grab me. But like Demon Slayer, I was pretty much hooked from like the first 10 minutes.
No, dude, Demon Slayer is really good. For any of you who are listening or watching this at home, if you haven't heard of Demon Slayer, I'm genuinely surprised, because Demon Slayer is, as of the moment, at the forefront of the anime industry. Mm-hmm. And it's predominantly because of the animation they're doing in the show. But it's just a good show.
Yeah.
Like, it started good. It did have a little bit of a lull in the first season, I think so at least, right before the Spider Family.
See, I didn't feel a lull. I can understand. Mm-hmm. I know exactly where you're talking about, but for some reason I didn't feel a real lull in there. And was the Spider Family before? No, because I really liked the Drum Demon. Like that one, I really liked that as like a little mini self-contained story arc in the middle of the series. I really liked that. But I never experienced the lull. But when they shortened the second arc and then the third arc, which is where I'm at right now, I just finished the third arc. With the entertainment district.
That's the second arc.
Oh, is that the second arc? Well, where does like the Rengoku thing in the train take place? I thought that was second, and then the entertainment district was third.
The Mugen Train is a movie.
Oh,
if you're talking anime-wise, Mugen Train's the movie that takes place between season 1 and 2.
Okay.
In the book, that is the second arc. Mugen Train is arc 2.
Okay. So I'm at the end of the entertainment district arc, and those ones being shorter definitely told a tighter, more cohesive story. But one of the things that I was really happy about with like the first season, when Shinjiro got his sword and he went through his... Is that Shinjiro? Tanjiro, yeah, sorry. Tanjiro. When he got his katana, like he went through the training and everything, and we talked about this too, that I was like, is this going to be another My Hero where like the entire first season is just him training? And then they like pretty much summarized a year and a half worth of training in like 2 episodes.
Oh yeah, there's a point in the beginning of Demon Slayer, I think within the first 5 episodes, like 4 years of time passed.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel like it.
No.
Like, because the first time I watched it, I actually missed the line where they mentioned how much time had passed. And then, like,
you realize Nezuko has been asleep for like 2 years.
Yeah, and like someone mentioned that, and I was like, what? It's been, hold on, I missed something here because it's been 5 minutes.
And I think this is another reason why manga is outselling comics right now. That not only is it very much self-contained stories, not only is it easier to purchase and find, but accessibility-wise, I feel it's less intimidating to jump into a new manga than it is if you see Detective Comics and you're like, issue 1000, like issue 1052, how am I going to catch up with this? Like, not... Like, I do give comics this, that, like, they definitely have good jumping in points. That, like, if you pick up a comic, it would only take you about 2 or 3 issues to figure out what's going on and where you are, especially if you're starting a new story arc, because they do a pretty good job of, like, easing you into things. But there's no way anybody knows that. They just see these high numbers. And collectors want those high numbers. They like that continuous continuity. And I will admit, even I like that. Like this week, Wonder Woman 800 is coming out, and then they're ending the series. And then in like a couple of months, Wonder Woman issue 1 is going to come out, and they're going to start the series up again. And I get why they're doing that, but at the same time, as a collector, it's like, no, I want this to get to 1,000 issues too. But I get why they can't do that. And I think the only reason that like Detective Comics and Action Comics, they have let go to like issues 1,000 and above is because it's Detective Comics and it's Action Comics. They are the oldest existing comic titles going on right now. Like, I know Captain America has been around. I know like Superman himself has been around. I know Spider-Man has been around. But just like Action Comics, Detective Comics, that has been consecutively going monthly for decades. And so like that is pretty much just we got to keep this going. We got to keep this going.
But that also in turn will, if not already, lead to fatigue in those comics. Because like I'm sure there's people that every week the next issue comes out, they're there, they got it within seconds of it hitting the shelves. But those are also the same people that more than likely only want it to keep going because the number's so high, because it's been going on so long, not because that they're diehard Superman fans or something. Whereas, again, to flip it over here, like One Piece has also been going on for a very long time. It's one of the longest running mangas to date.
Yeah.
But like it's just One Piece.
Yeah.
Like it is just One Piece. You go to volume 1, you read that story to where we're at now.
Yeah.
There's nothing else. There's no like, it's a dumb joke, but there's no like two-piece. There's no like continuation of what's happening. There's like one-off stories that might be like slight spin-offs to explain this character or that character. But for the most part, it's just One Piece. There's no one else intermingling. There's nothing. There is like Demon Slayer will never cross over to One Piece. It is its own world in its entirety.
And I think that's why like Marvel has started to do this. Like I have in my hand right now the Amazing Spider-Man. It's issue 27. Like they ended the Amazing Spider-Man, and then like literally like 2 months later they came out with issue 1 again. Like they didn't even give it time to like simmer and let people miss it. But if you look at this, it says issue 27, and then right underneath it has LGY number 921.
Legacy?
Yes, the Legacy issue. So they're doing this to try and like lower the numbers to bring people into reading comics more. But then they give it the Legacy number 2 for the collectors. Yeah. Which isn't a bad idea, but at the same time, it's like, is that really...
It's pointless.
Yeah. But, well, I don't think it's pointless, because I think what it helps to do is, for as many times as they've started and stopped The Amazing Spider-Man, because there was the original run of The Amazing Spider-Man that started back in the 40s? I can't remember when Stan Lee started doing it. Maybe the 50s? Don't at me.
We'll call Stan later and ask.
Stan Lee's dead.
I know.
Okay. But... there was the original run, and then they ended that, and so like for about a year, I think, they didn't have their most popular character in comics. And then they started up, Spider-Man number 1, and then they just ended it again, and then they did Spider-Man number 1. So I get like the point of the Legacy numbers is that if you're a collector and you have the original run of Spider-Man, then you have this run of Spider-Man, then you have this run of Spider-Man, or if you're somebody new that's trying to find The Amazing Spider-Man issue 27, there's like now at least three issue 27s that the Legacy number will give you an idea of where it fits into continuity. DC tried to do this with their entire DC universe, I think like a decade ago. If you've listened to the show, if you know me at all, you've heard me talk about the New 52 and my absolute disdain for it.
We love it here.
But when they tried to reboot the entire universe, I was originally excited about that, because I was like, this is going to be cool, getting to see Batman face off against Joker for the first time, getting to see Wonder Woman enter the real, like the man's world for the first time, Clark meeting Lois for the first time, like all these iconic moments. But then all of the continuity that had already happened, you were supposed to believe still happened in this new universe. It just happened before you started reading. So, like, it was Doomsday was around, and there was, like, beef between, like, Supes and Doomsday, and so they were very ambiguous as to, like, so did the death of Superman happen? And then Bane showed up in one issue, and it was like, so Bats has had his back broken already? He's already gone through like 3 or 4 Robins at this point, but we still didn't get to see them. You know what I mean? Like, so they said they restarted everything, but they really didn't.
They kind of just hop to a different universe and put you in the middle and be like, you get the gist of what happened, but here's what's happening now.
Right, and there was like, when the issues came out, there was this timeline that like nobody really knew about, that like it was supposed to be like the Age of Heroes, that like all of these heroes had been around for like maybe 3 or 4 years, but Batman was supposed to be around for 10 years, which also flies in the face of like what DC purists think, that like Superman was the first, okay? And this one, Batman was the first because it's Batman, and why not? But it if they were going to do that, I wish they would have just like had the nuts to go all the way. Just wipe the entire table clean and say, this is Action Comics #1. This is where we're starting our story.
No, and you describing all that made something click in my head, actually. When it comes to comic books, separate them, Marvel, DC, whatever, they pretty much operate the same way. You have various comic books that are all telling the story of the same world.
Right.
Whereas manga is different mangas telling the story of separate worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was the draw to me to get into manga versus comic books.
Okay.
Because no matter what comic book I picked up of Marvel, I was still going to read the same world that any other person of Marvel was reading into. I'm just getting this story in this city over here.
Right.
And I think even if Wonder Woman, not if, but Wonder Woman's back to issue 1, even if I pick that up and I read that, it's still not going to feel independent to me.
No, it's not.
It's going to feel like, oh, this is a new Wonder Woman in a old comic book world. Like, everything still happened. Even if I don't need to know it, it's still, at least to me, it feels like I've missed the train.
Right.
Like, I'm not, at this point, I genuinely do not think I will ever get into comics because of that. Because there is no definitive start point for me unless it's the beginning. Like, for me personally, how I work, I would have to go back, read Action Comics and Detective Comics Volume 1 and catch up. Because
Unlike
otherwise,
50 years of comics.
Because it would bother me if I read something in today's issue that referenced an issue 300 issues ago, and I'm sitting there like, well, I want to know what that is. And that's just my biggest issue with comic books is they don't feel isolated enough for me to read them.
Okay.
Even if I read Wonder Woman, I'm going to feel like I need to read Superman. I need to read Batman. I need to understand how these people are going to form the Justice League and flip it to Marvel. Like, I'm not going to just read Iron Man. I'm going to read Iron Man and Captain America and Thor because they're the Avengers to me.
Well, I fell into that trap especially in the 90s, once I was, out of the allowance stage and I was working. I was like still living at home, so I didn't really have bills. The only thing I had to pay off was my Jeep. But I definitely fell into that trap that like at this time period, I was still mostly into Marvel. Like, I picked up Batman and I picked up Detective Comics and Shadow of the Bat and all of the Batman titles and Robin, and then that expanded into Catwoman, and like they just kept doing spin-off after spin-off after spin-off. And then when I was reading Marvel, like I read Ghost Rider, and Ghost Rider, even though it existed in the Marvel universe at that time, pretty much was its own self-contained thing. But I also read Thor. And like sometimes something would happen in Thor that would cross over into another comic, and it's like, okay, well, I got to buy this one now. And then I started reading Spider-Man, and then there was not only just the Amazing Spider-Man, there was the Web of Spider-Man, there was a Spectacular Spider-Man, and then McFarlane just brought out Spider-Man. So there's like 5 titles for one character right there, and I very much got caught into that trap. So imagine all of that going on the national scale, that people were buying, like, for one character, like 5 titles plus all the other, like, let's not even talk about how many X titles there were for, like, the X-Men. And they were available anywhere. Now you pull all of that back, you drop it just into comic book shops, which, let's be honest, even today are like tucked away in these little corners of society where they're not exactly the easiest thing to find. And if you do find one, there's like maybe one around you. And then they expected to be doing the same amount of business. And then they weren't doing the same amount of business. So the people that went and found these comic shops and kept buying directly from these comic shops or getting at-home subscriptions were rewarded for their, dedication by having the prices raised astronomically per title. That is what I personally feel started the downfall of the interest in comics. Like, not the downfall of comics, because, like, I still think they were doing good stuff. I still think there were good titles coming out. Like, I love the Extinction Agenda. Pretty much any crisis event that happens in DC, I'm all in on it, except for Dark Knights. We're not even going to talk about that. But the they made it harder to find, and then they made it more expensive. And while they were still doing good stuff, people were like, "Are you kidding me? Like, now I can't just run to the grocery store or like pick stuff up when I'm like grocery shopping, or pick stuff up at a gas station when I'm filling up. Now I have to make a special trip out to this place, this one place, to get my books, and you raise the price on me." And I think that's when like a lot of like ambivalence started to happen with comic books, which the 90s was also ironically the time that manga started, like, not anime, but manga started rolling in. So now people can walk into bookstores, or people could walk into places like record stores, Suncoast Video, and there it is, like, and it's easy to access. And it's like, okay, I'll give this a shot. And that, I think that is one of the things that started to flip the needle towards manga.
I know a brief history of anime and manga when it comes to America. Like, to go back, all the way back into the 60s, when anime first hit America, like you said, Astro Boy, Speed Racer, all those were the first ones, but they were heavily edited before they got here. Like, plot points were by and large taken out of shows, violence was removed, so it was anime, but by the time it got here, it was very watered down, it was very edited, it was more akin to cartoons. And so the 70s, you still had those series, but 70s was kind of a dry spell for anime here. And then the 80s came around, and that's when the mecha shows got big. That's when it was right before Robotech. That was
Voltron and Transor Z.
Yeah. And what was the Star one? Star Chasers?
Star Blazers, which was Space Battleship Yamato, but that and Battle of the Planets happened in the 70s.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying, like, they were popular here in the 80s.
Yeah.
And even those were edited. Like, you didn't get the full story for those things. They were also heavily edited. It wasn't until Robotech, actually, that things started to actually have a full developed story that came from Japan, even though, like you said, Robotech is 3 different series put together. But it kept the story of the series intact, more or less.
But what's funny about Robotech, and because it was on syndication, I can't say if this happened everywhere, like across the country, but I know here in PA, and it's not like the Mandela effect, like everybody has acknowledged that, yeah, this happened, because like you can even find 2 different versions of it if you look for it. In Robotech, I think it was like the 3rd episode, there is a moment that like really made us go like, oh, it's this kind of show, where the enemy, the Zentradi, the aliens, are orbital bombarding the planet, okay, and they're firing on what I assume was New York, because you saw the Twin Towers, and there was like this army guy, and he was talking to this little girl, and she had a flower, and the dialogue very specifically said, "How old are you, little girl?" And she goes, 2, and then blows up. just dead. The second time around, because Robotech reached its end, because anime and manga has an end, it reached its end and it started looping through. That scene was cut.
Yeah.
It was like they got it past the censors the first time, but like when they showed it, they were like, yo, we got to take that out.
America can't handle that yet.
Well, they just did.
They're gonna, bud. But then you get to the 90s, and that's when, you know, all the big ones that you will probably have heard about, like Dragon Ball started, and Akira, Ghost in the Shell, all the big ones.
Ghost in the Shell, yeah.
You had movies that started coming over more than just series, and like you said, manga got big in the 90s.
Yeah.
And the 90s in America led to the explosion of anime in the 2000s, because what finally happened in the 90s is there was finally a company that started syndicating anime.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't anything great at first. It wasn't until Crunchyroll and specifically Toei Animation started doing simulcasts that American audiences could actually watch an anime in congruence to Japan when it was released.
I can't remember the name of the company, but I know who you're talking about.
Then in the early 2000s is where I'm looping this back to where you were saying how you thought Dragon Ball kind of felt watered down after what you saw in the like 80s and 90s, and that's exactly what happened.
Okay.
Dragon Ball itself was not watered down, but Dragon Ball got popular, and it wasn't that ultra-violence, gore, or dark, really, as the other stuff. Well, in the 2000s, there was this, I don't know, TV production company, something of the sort, called 4Kids, that did their own like in-house voiceovers to anime, and then they would edit the anime to just be kid-friendly, which really shows that we didn't really grasp what anime was at that point, because some anime is kid-friendly, but anime isn't like a specific thing. Anime is the name for the entire industry of Japan.
Right.
Like, there's horror, there's action, there's robots, there's vampires.
Yeah.
Like, there are separate genres within anime, and we didn't really get that here. So 4Kids started doing these very, very bad translations and edits of these shows, but then you had Toei Animation doing official translations and everything, keeping them intact. So in the early 2000s, you had this violence wiped version of anime coming from Japan, which is probably exactly where you get this feeling from, like, why did all of a sudden this just get all like child friendly?
Yeah.
And then in the late 2000s into the 2010s, you had the issue of people couldn't figure out if anime was for kids or if it was for adults, because you'd put an anime on, and if you had like a kid and you're leaving it on for them, and you leave the room, come back, and now there's a dude eating this dude's stomach out because he was a vampire or something.
Yeah.
You didn't know that was going to happen, so now you have issues. You don't trust anime at all. And it was largely to do with how we were pushing anime at the time. We just straight up didn't know how to take it.
Well, I don't think America knows how to, and this is not me hating on our own country, please understand that, but I don't think we know how, even still know how to handle animation, our own cartoons.
We don't.
Things like that. Like, there is a DC animated movie, Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, that's rated R. Like, I don't think a parent would be able to wrap their head around it. Like, I don't think most parents would even look at the rating of an animated movie from DC Comics. And I think another thing that leads to comics or manga outselling comics is that pretty much adults or young adults or adults buy comics now because of what we keep going back to, the inaccessibility of them. It's not like you can be a kid that like rides to the store on their bike and picks up an issue of Thor and then goes home with it. And the audience by default has grown because they haven't done much to cultivate a new audience, but they still write them like they're writing for kids, which is why I think a lot of stuff is very saturated compared to things like manga. Now, there is this new, I shouldn't say new, but there's like a very popular phenomenon, trope, tendency, whatever you want to call it, with Marvel Comics right now, which has to do with this one. And this is Warlock Rebirth, all right? This is the story of Adam Warlock and the Infinity Watch. This story actually takes place after the Infinity Gauntlet series, like back in the 90s. Like, this is set back in those times. Like, you can even see from the cover that the cover of the comic is even done in the way that the cover of a comic would be done during that time period. And they're going back to that because those were arguably like some really great days of storytelling for Marvel Comics. Like, they had the Infinity Gauntlet saga, then they had the Infinity Gauntlet, then they had the Infinity War, and like they just had that storyline going on. Silver Surfer was big, like the whole cosmic heroes thing was very big for them. And they were doing pretty well at that point, storytelling wise. And the one of the main reasons they were doing so well at the time was because the X-Men were huge. And I find it very interesting that they're framing stories, because they've done it with Adam Warlock, they've done it with Ghost Rider, and they've done it with the Fantastic Four, that these stories all take place during a time in like the 90s. And it's like, if you didn't realize your audience was of a certain age, you wouldn't be doing that and you wouldn't be having as much success with it. So why don't you realize that like it's time to update the way that you handle comic books? One that I can remember happened a few years ago. There's this label, it's called DC Black Label, where it's supposed to be like an adult label of comics for DC Comics. Mm-hmm. And there was a panel, it was for Batman, and there was a panel where they just drew Bruce full on frontal, okay? He was in the cave, he had just got done fighting, he took the bat suit off, he was full on frontal. The media made such a ridiculously big deal out of this, that Bruce was naked in a panel. So much that the next printings shaded it all out. And I'm like, is this, like, aren't we mature enough to handle this? Like, why is this even a story?
Yeah.
And then the only thing that did was draw even more attention to it, because then my guy Alvin, who runs the comic shop where I get things, he said he had kids running in and, like, looking for that. Just because Bruce is naked, and like, what do you do in that situation? Like, there was no problem until we as adults couldn't maturely handle the situation. Mm-hmm. It's Black Label. It's said that it's for adults, for goodness sakes. We don't know how to handle animation and comics and art in a mature adult way.
It is like the mentality we have here in America is, if it's not live action, it's for a child.
Yeah.
Like, if it is hand drawn, it is a child's work thing.
Yeah.
Like, I've never gotten that mentality.
No.
Because...
Yeah, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, like, I'm not saying comics aren't for kids. Mm-hmm. There should absolutely be comics for kids. If for no other reason, we need to cultivate a new generation of consumers. We need to cultivate a new generation.
Capitalism.
We need to cultivate a new generation of comic book readers if this media wants to continue to strive. Because for adults, either we're going to get bored with it, there's going to be other things that require our money, or we're going to die.
Yeah.
Okay. And if there's no new generation to pick up comic book reading, like, what's going to happen to all of these titles? Like, I don't think the industry is thinking that far in advance. Like, they're thinking in the here and now. How can we make money now?
And it's movies. Like, it's all movies right now.
Not the long term. And there does need to be kid comics, kid-friendly comics. And, like, there was a very short run of, like, Spider-Man comics that, like, had, like, little chibi Spider-Man, and it was, like, Spider-Man and Miles and Gwen, and they were, like, all friends at school, but they had superpowers. And, like, that would be cool gateway to get, like, kids into reading things. But then you go back to the whole accessibility thing. And it's like, why isn't it easier to get these into people's hands? Like, that, I do not for the life of me understand how they thought funneling everything through just comic shops was a good idea. I don't understand why they thought that was a good idea. It's like my buddy Ben. When we were growing up, or our buddy Ben, I'm sorry.
Never met the man.
When we were growing up, like, and even now, his favorite superhero has always been Spider-Man. He's seen all the movies, and he may not have seen, like, every movie that Spider-Man was in the MCU, but he's seen, like, the main Spider-Man movies. He's never read a comic in his life. He even asked me, like, where do you even go to get these? He had to go online and find, like, the nearest comic shop to him. But because it's not on the way home from work, it's been, like, half a year since he asked me that question, and he still hasn't been able to like, just go get a copy of Amazing Spider-Man. And that's not reaching, like, your potential for, like, as far as distribution goes.
And look, I'm not going to sit here and say, you know, I want Walmart and Target to be their savior or anything like that, but you got to put it back in the stores.
Yeah.
Like, that's the big thing. Like, I'm not going to a comic book shop. Where I am going is Walmart. And you know what else I buy at Walmart outside of food and everything? Like, I buy Legos.
Yeah.
I buy video games from Walmart. Again, I'm not saying that's where I go for those things, but if I'm there, those are the other things I'm looking at that are, like, entertainment, that are extra to me. So if you put manga, you put comic books into Walmart again, I'm going to go look at that section almost every time I'm there.
Yeah.
And just me looking at that section, trust me, I'm not that great with money. I'm gonna feel guilt if I'm like, is that the new One Piece volume? I don't need to eat tonight, man. I'm reading this.
Yeah. No, I know. It's a problem that I feel like the industry has created themselves. And I feel like the main titles, the big three right now, DC, Marvel, and Image. And Image is barely just up there with the two of them.
Is Image Dark Horse?
No.
Or is that a different studio?
Dark Horse is different.
Okay,
Image is Todd McFarlane's company. I really feel like they're not getting it. They're not cluing in that, like, their idea of boosting sales is just make more titles, get people to buy more while they're there. Whereas the independent companies, I feel, are really trying new things. And this takes us to something that we have been talking about, is a very gory, grim title. That if the title doesn't tell you everything you need to know about it, I don't know what does. Something is killing the children. It's, if you like Buffy, if you like Supernatural, but wish it was just more violent,
less hopeful,
and less hopeful, that's Something is Killing the Children is for you.
But
a sentence I never thought I would say. But, and I think, and you've already touched on it, the reason why you were able to get into that is because I was able to say, hey, this trade paperback starts the story. And it is a good story. It is very engaging story.
It feels very thought out from where I'm at. And it wasn't. I mean, like, the first run of the comics was very short. It was supposed to be a one-off, got very popular, now it's ongoing.
Yeah.
But even if you read the initial run and then go to the next one, it feels seamless.
Yeah.
Like, it feels like, okay, this is logically what's happening next. But I think you're right on the money with that. Independent studios are just doing what studios used to do. Like, they're trying things.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We'll cancel the title, we'll move on. But, like, Something is Killing the Children, that has a artistic style about it that I haven't seen before. It's very sloppy, honestly. It is not clean. And that's the thing that catches me off guard the most about it, is I don't like that style.
It looks great, though.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. I love the style in this book, but that style overall, I do not like. I don't like the sloppy style. Make it concrete of what I'm seeing. I don't know why I'm like that, but I don't like sloppy animation. You make it clean, make it crisp, make the objects defined.
Yeah.
And this does not do that. It is very open. Even the paneling, and I brought this up to you, the paneling of that story, it reminds me of One Piece. Vastly different content in those panels, But the way the panels are set up, it is constantly changing. Like, sometimes it's a panel that goes from both pages and you're going both down. And then the next one is like a bunch of small ones right in succession. And then, like, there are pages that straight up don't even have words.
Yeah.
It is not a word-heavy book at all.
Very action-oriented.
But it is visually so entertaining that there was one point that I read the first book and then had to wait to get the second one. Bought the second one, and then I was like, this is garbage. So then I just bought volume 3 and 4 at the same time. Like, I really got into that. And the reason I'm pushing it so hard is because, honestly, I'm pretty sure this is the first comic book that I've gotten into from the start. Like, I've read Death of Superman. I've read The Dark Knight. It's not The Dark Knight. What's the book? Dark Knight Rises?
The Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah, The Dark Knight Returns.
By Frank Miller.
Yeah. Like, I've read those two books. I liked them both. But to my understanding, they're more or less one-off things.
So, as we did last week, we're running over time.
That's pretty huge.
But I think that pretty much sums up everything. Like, the point of this was to basically talk about the differences between comics and manga and why we think manga is outselling comics. And we're obviously not going to solve the comic crisis right now, but I think we both can agree that this is a problem that was created by the industry themselves. And I don't think they're course correcting in any way near the correct way to handle it. I think they need to make them more accessible. I think they need to lower the price again, because if they want to sell all of these titles, like right now, even the comics that I collect, it's not near the amount that I normally would have back in the day. But I really think that distribution, accessibility, price, quality is something that can be argued, and not by us, because I don't think either one of us think that one is better than the other. They are by far different.
Yeah, they're two. I hate to use this phrase, but it's like apples and oranges.
Yeah.
They are just different entities. At the core, they're the same thing. That's why we can sit here and talk or note the differences.
Yeah.
But we have to look at it beyond just the paper that's sitting in front of us.
Yeah.
The industry is different.
Yes.
The way the Japanese go about manga and anime is completely different than we go about comic books and cartoons.
Yeah.
And I think really that's where the desertion comes from. Like, I can set One Piece right next to Detective Comics, and we can go panel for panel and be like, well, this looks good, this doesn't.
You'll have considerably more panels.
Yeah. But it really feels more like a culture v. culture situation when it comes to this. Comics are on a down spiral, which is weird to say because of how popular the comic book movies are.
Well, and I think the other problem there is that, and none of the MCU movies like really promote reading comics.
Absolutely not. It's their own thing.
They use a lot of the same titles, like Civil War, like the Infinity Saga, the Infinity Gauntlet, the Infinity War. The characters obviously are the same, but like, if you pick up a comic, if you're a fan of the MCU and you've never read a comic before, what you pick up and start reading is not going to be the same as what you saw on the screen. And the DC movies were very much like that as well, which is why I really like that when Gunn came out and said, hey, this is what we're doing this based off of this run, we're doing this based off of this run, that it really invigorated people to go out and buy these comics. Like, these trade paperbacks, these graphic novels were selling out for the first time in years. And now, not so much with The Flash, at least maybe with the Flash trailer, but definitely with like Blue Beetle trailer, when the trailers are over, there's like, read these. You know what I mean? Like, at the end of the Blue Beetle trailer, they put up like a series of titles and said, if you want to know more, read these, and that'll get you caught up. At the end of the Flash trailer, I think they showed like the Flashpoint. They even actually started reprinting the Flashpoint story for the build-up to the Flash movie. And that's what they need to do. Like, you have the movies that are reaching this wider audience, but you're doing nothing to direct them towards buying the comics. Why?
And just again to flip it for manga and anime, they have the system down pat. Really, either it's the manga's already finished, so it doesn't matter how the anime comes out,
Right.
or like again, just One Piece is still ongoing. There is still weekly chapters and everything, but the anime will always be behind the manga,
Right.
because the manga is the source material. You want the manga to do the story so that you can make it, or you end up like the first Full Metal Alchemist,
Right.
where you get 90 or I don't know 75% of the way through the story, and then you just have to start making stuff up. And to really hit it home to American audiences, think of Game of Thrones. See what happens when the last book isn't written and you just have to start putting stuff on a screen. You get a war that doesn't make sense logistically, visually, or like thematically.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, at least I find it interesting that like you are into something that's killing the children, but you're buying it in the trade paperback format where like you have entire chapters of, you have like 5 issues in one thing, so you get a full story arc. There has been a movement, and I don't know how big it actually is, but there has been a movement that has been like petitioning DC and Marvel, just write in the trade paperback form.
Yeah.
Bring out a trade paperback, like maybe a new one like once every 2 months or something. Just give us the trade paperback, give it to us at like the discounted price of having to buy 5 separate issues. Basically make it more like manga, and make it accessible. Like, and at first I was very much against that, but then after seeing you get into it and picking up something that's killing the children, and you're getting caught up to where you can just pick up the floppies off of the shelf, but you already told me, nah, I'm just going to wait for the trade paperback. Just do that. Like, if this is what a new generation of readers want, this is what you need to do to like encourage new readers, new buyers, new people, new interest in these titles. Thank you all for listening. Tune in next week. Next week is a very spoiler laden episode that we are actually going to go see The Flash. And then we thought that since it ties into a lot of what we've been talking about up until this point, especially tying back into the first episode, that we're going to talk about it, and it is going to be very spoiler heavy. So,
and I've seen Batman Returns, so I'm prepared for this movie now. None of y'all can come at me.
Thank you all for listening. As always, I'm Mac.
I'm Uncle Britt.
And this has been Ralph World.
Ralph World.